At the root of the Rastafari philosophy is the repatriation of all the descendants of those Africans who were kidnapped and taken away from their West African homeland and brought to the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas to serve as slaves. Even if not in name, this philosophy began on the very first day that an African was landed by force into that part of the world. His desire to be returned to his homeland could not be quenched, and the driving spirit of energy that it ignited would be passed down through generation to generation. This guiding spirit, a gift from the ancestors, would be the driving force that led the first African slaves on the island of Jamaica to choose freedom from the Spanish, and take refuge in the mountainous regions. Appalled by the treatment of fellow Africans under the British system of chattel slavery that had been introduced on the island, they would organize many raids on the plantations to free their African brothers and sisters who remained enslaved. A show of natural African empathy and love, even stretching beyond nationalistic and tribal differences. As their original languages began to fade from the memory of the African descendants, the spirit of a black oneness, referred to by Marcus Garvey as one love, began to grow in recognition of the common struggle stretching forward even beyond the eventual abolition of slavery, sometimes, it may be added, with fatal consequences due to infighting and betrayal, often referred to in Jamaica as bad mind. Marcus Garvey's presence in New York at the time of the Harlem Renaissance gave him the perfect platform, allowing him to espouse his already formed ideas regarding the situation that the black man found himself in. The message that he delivered through his UNIA organization was massively received by the black people of the Americas, and in the Caribbean, and even in Africa black intellectuals had also begun taking note. His success in reaching the black masses globally also brought him and several of his followers to the attention of the white American authorities, with J. Edgar Hoover carving out his career at the Bureau of Investigations in the pursuit of the UNIA leader. Ethiopianism, which was a variation on Christianity which took a black perspective with the aim of dismantling the prevailing system of white supremacy, was gaining more influence amongst black Christian communities across the African diaspora. One such church established in Jamaica and operating during Garvey's rise in Harlem, was the Jamaica Native Baptist Free Church, established by a self-professed messenger of God, Alexander Bedward. His uncompromising stance against the position of the British colonial authorities in Jamaica, alongside his growing popularity on the island, made him a target, and he would find himself being condemned to see out his last days in a mental asylum. But the radical anti-colonial stance that he had encouraged in his sermons would stay with his most loyal followers, who would carry their Bible-driven hardcore perspective with them as they turned to political Garveyism, as had been recommended by Bedward himself, with the promise of repatriation back to their African homeland. After imprisonment, followed by deportation from America, Garvey began to refocus his UNIA activities back in Jamaica. He established several small businesses to support the raising of funds for his organization and its aims. As one of these ventures, Garvey wrote a play called Coronation of an African King, a story revolving around a fictional prince called Prince Cudjoe of Nubia, performed in Kingston just months before the crowning of Haile Selassie in Abyssinia. With many of the Bedwardites amongst the Garvey followers already seeing him as a prophet, the play would soon be seen as a prophecy foretelling of the coming of a great black king in Africa. In Harlem, a young Jamaican by the name of Leonard Howell, impressed by what Marcus Garvey was trying to achieve, had long been a fully signed up and paid member of the UNIA. He also had heard of the prophecy telling of the crowning of a new black king in Africa, and joining up the dots, came to the conclusion that Emperor Haile Selassie I must be the Messiah who would come to set the African peoples of the world free. He would face deportation from America in 1932 before being rejected by his own family because of his newly found beliefs. So, within a matter of a few weeks of his return to Jamaica, Leonard Howell, by now in his mid-30s, left his home district of Clarendon and headed for Kingston with the intention of spreading the good news of Rastafari, the black king who would redeem all black people, freeing them from all of their colonial chains. There were a few who would take to his word almost immediately, including Joseph Hibbert, who had himself already started to preach about the divinity of Haile Selassie. But having had little success in Kingston, Howell soon relocated to the parish of St. Thomas, where he began to gain a steady following that was starting to get him unwanted attention from the British colonial authorities, who perceived his gatherings as being seditious in nature and began to closely monitor him. In Europe, tension had been building as Italy began a propaganda campaign against Ethiopia and its new emperor, to muster support for their ambitions in East Africa through a fake news report that had been circulating in newspapers across the continent in 1934. It stated that Haile Selassie had gathered a secret confederation of 20 million black soldiers, including among them all those trained in European and Western armies, to fight in the ultimate race war, going under the name Nyibingi, which they claimed with no base in fact, translated to mean death to whites. The name was actually that of a legendary 18th century East African queen from the Rwanda-Uganda region, meaning abundance. Howell, along with one of his followers Robert Hines, a former Bedouinite, would be arrested and jailed on charges of sedition in the same year, but unhindered and most likely encouraged by the Nyibingi article when it appeared in the Jamaica Times in 1935. He was determined to continue to preach his Rastafari philosophy to fellow inmates. Inspired by his success in recruiting new followers amongst his prison inmates, he wrote a book called The Promised Key, written while he was still in prison. In the book, he places Haile Selassie into the position of God, while the Pope of Rome is the devil, and all of God's people, the black people, would be his righteous soldiers ready to fight the final war as highlighted in the Book of Revelation. Curiously, when the book was published in 1935 whilst Howell was still in prison, he chose a pen name that was neither Christian or even Abrahamic. Instead, he opted for the Hindu-influenced name of Gangun Guru Mara, meaning wise and virtuous teacher. This can be seen as a demonstration of his willingness not only to dismantle the system of white supremacy and European colonialism, but also that he was ready to smash the westernized notion of religion and God, with a capital G, as opposed to the ancient concepts relating to multiple deities or gods, with a small g, operating obediently under the guidance of a greater force, as the Hindus themselves practiced in their religious and cultural expression, with little if any hassle from the British colonial authorities on the island. Marcus Garvey had relocated himself to London in this year and had been eager to show his support for Emperor Haile Selassie's government in Ethiopia, who were facing an illegal invasion by Mussolini's Italian army. But after his attempts to meet with the emperor, when he had gone into exile in England, as part of a party of black delegates was rebuffed, Garvey took this personally and became critical of him and his system of rule, describing him as a coward who ran away from his country to save his own skin. His comments would cause a split within the UNIA membership, with those amongst the Howellites and others who had by then developed an unbending support for the emperor, beginning to distance themselves from Garvey. Leonard Howell's release from prison in 1936 would not see an end to the close surveillance that he was being put under by the colonial authorities, and in 1938, based on the writings in his book The Promised Key, he would be declared insane and put into the Bellevue Hospital mental asylum in Jamaica. It is very likely that the British authorities had used this as a pretext to get Howell out of circulation while the Ethiopia-Italy situation was still unresolved. His release from the asylum coming somewhat coincidentally during the same period of time that Mussolini's Italy turned against its allies in Europe and declared war against Britain and France by invading some of its African colonial territories. After his release he decided to establish a Rastafari village community on a hill in the Sliggerville region of St. Catherine that would become known as Pinnacle, housing up to 3,000 followers. In a first of its kind in the country, the village quickly developed into a self-sustaining commune with little if any need for outside resources or support. Ganja, the holy weed, its use on the island still generally tolerated if not ignored at this time, played a significant part in the religious rituals of the Rastas. The British colonial authorities suspected that the village was a communist experiment and monitored it closely, infiltrating it with agents and informants, and launching several raids on the site. By the following year, Howell was again arrested, charged with sedition and sent to prison to serve a 2-year sentence. Pinnacle would continue to be the subject of police raids throughout the 40s and through to 1954 when the ganja laws were hardened by the no-nonsense Chief Minister Bustamante, seeing the police virtually destroy the site. This would prove to be the first in a series of anti-Rasta actions taken by Bustamante, culminating in the Coral Gardens incident of 1963, where it is claimed that he unofficially called for the Rastas to be totally wiped out, whether in the prisons or the cemetery. Many of the Rastas who had been expelled from Pinnacle during the mid to late 50s would relocate to a slum district in Kingston known as Back A Wall, where a Kingston-based Rastaman called Mortimo Plano led regular drumming and chanting ceremonies. With the Rastas in Kingston and other parts of the island continuing to face repeated harassment from the authorities and rejection from the general public into the late 50s, Mortimo Plano made an approach to the University of the West Indies to ask them to carry out an anthropological study of the Rastaman in hope of improving relationships between them and the rest of the population. In 1961 the semi-autonomous Jamaican government led by Premier Norman Manley agreed to send a party of officials and delegates including members of the Rastafari leadership, Mortimo Plano amongst them, on a fact-finding mission to several countries in West Africa. During the tour they went to Ethiopia where they met with Haile Selassie who told them that Ethiopia was large enough to hold all of the African descendants displaced into the other parts of the world through the slave trade. He also presented each of the Rastas with a gold medallion. Although Jamaica was in 1962 an independent country, with Bustamante as its first prime minister, the situation for the Rastas had worsened under his determined anti-Rasta stance. A stroke suffered by him in 1965 would force him to take a back seat from his duties as Prime Minister, leaving his deputy Donald Sangster to lead in his place. The following year would see a visit to the island by Haile Selassie which would be the beginning of a slowly growing, but hard-fought for tolerance and acceptance of the people of the Rastafari community and faith amongst the general population. This brief outline of the development of Rastafari in Jamaica shows a number of principles underlining the core mode of operation within that liberty, as follows. Repatriation back to Ethiopia, Africa, the land of the enslaved ancestors. Black unity, universal love, trust, loyalty and honor. Anti-colonial, promoting programs of black empowerment. Spirituality, dismantling ideologies supporting enslavement and war. Self-reliance, production of food, medicine and eco-energy systems. Drumming, chanting, spiritual upliftment and thanksgiving. Socialism, friendly and neighborly relations.